today's Equipping the Saints webinar. It's really good to have you with us. Our Equipping the Saints webinar was designed to not just provide information from our Synod office, but also, and equally important, to connect you to one another. I mean, you are in the trenches and you are wonderful resources for one another. So we decided that we'd like to do this on a regular basis. We did it a couple of weeks ago and it was met with enthusiasm, and also requested that we continue to hold these weekly meetings with the bishop and with each other so that we have an opportunity to walk together during this unusual time. Occasionally, we're also going to invite special guests to the webinars to talk about maybe some creative ideas of staying in connected community with their own congregations. So from time to time, we'll be doing that as well. So today, this afternoon, we're going to open with prayer, and then Bishop Rogness will give his opening remarks. And during his opening remarks, if you want to write your questions down in the chat room area, and then he'll address those during our conversation. At that time, we will, Robin will unmute people as we call on your questions, just in case you have any follow-up to that as he is addressing those. Also, just to make a note that we are recording this webinar for those who couldn't make it in person, and also if you want to go back and reference anything that you might have missed during the webinar, we'll be making that available for later review. Okay, so let's open with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, we gather today as your followers for holy conversations about how you would have us reopen our church buildings so that we may once again gather in both body and spirit. We know your love is steadfast through this time of the pandemic and have confidence that you are with us always. Your mercies begin afresh each day. Help us to be thoughtful about ways to safely gather while honoring your presence in our midst. While we know it is not easy to be sure and certain in these times, guide us as we continue to faithfully lead our worshiping communities. Satisfy our hunger and thirst to regather in person in your holy name. We ask this through your Son, our Lord. Amen. Bishop Rogness, thank you. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, and thanks to Vicki and Robin especially for setting these things up. We did it 2 weeks ago, and as Vicki said, we had a far greater response than we thought we would, and there was interest in continuing the conversation, continuing the opportunity for conversation. So we decided we'd set these up and do them with some regularity for whoever finds it helpful and wants to tune in. I started the conversation 2 weeks ago by reminding people about Lutheran polity, which is the bishop doesn't come on the screen and announce to everybody just what you're going to do in your parishes. Catholics might pull that off, and maybe some others, but Lutherans tend to be a bit more independent than that. But on the other hand, we aren't just a collection of Wild West independent people doing whatever they want. I have always liked to remind people of what the word synod is. We use it as a chunk of geography. There are 65 synods in the ELCA, and you can tell where each of them are. They're mostly identified geographically. But the word synod doesn't refer to, if you look it up, it isn't a bunch of geography. It is a gathering of church leaders. The Catholics use it right when you read about the Pope calls a synod of bishops, a gathering. And I think that's a good reminder for these conversations that we're holding here. I have a few comments to make to begin the ball rolling, but I thought from the very beginning, and continuing especially now during this phase that I'll talk about in a minute, that it's very helpful to be in conversation together. I've popped into a number of conference meetings or text studies, and pastors share notes about what's going on in their own place, and they learn from each other and get some insights and some ideas. I think that's the kind of forum we're seeking to create here. This isn't going to be an hour-long lecture. This is going to be a back and forth discussion, which is why Vicki said, find the little chat line on the bottom, and as questions occur to you, either that you brought with you to this as you tuned in, or that occur to you as we're talking, be quick to note them there, and we'll go in whatever way the conversation seems to want to go. So let me just sort of set the context for the moment. It was over 2 months ago now when it was clear that the virus and the pandemic was serious enough that that pretty much all across the board throughout the synod, we stopped worshiping together. Congregations simply ceased. Most everybody did. Businesses closed, you know all of that. And that has pretty much held as the way things have been for the last 2 months. Now we're on the threshold of some of those restrictions beginning to be relaxed a bit. And we begin to hear a wider variety of voices as to what we ought to be doing next. There are the very impatient voice, and we've got all those voices in most of our congregations. So you know what I'm talking about in terms of the spread of sentiment. We have the very impatient ones who said, we've been overreacting, we got to get back to normal. So what if a few people get sick? Life has that, so let's get back together. And then you've got the contrasting thought that says, we have to pay attention to what the scientists are telling us, that there is serious danger in opening ourselves up to the rampant spread. We have to slow the curve. Well, we've been in that for two months now, and the curve has slowed. The kind of eruption of a pandemic that can happen without any mitigation efforts hasn't happened. But it's clear this is a serious virus. It's a killer virus. And there is still plenty of reason for caution for us. But having said that, now in fact, in Wisconsin, today, May 26th, is a threshold day when some of the past cautions and regulations expire. And so a lot of congregations are beginning to ask the question, what next, and when do we come back? How do we come back? And I think that's what we'll be talking together again here. Let me tell you what I have observed throughout the synod, and some of you have eyes and ears to the ground as well, so we can learn from each other on this. Very few congregations have opened up worship to larger groups of up to 50. We're now on the threshold where, we need to acknowledge that even we talk about statewide regulations, Badger bounce back, but there are also county by county advisories being given now. The Forward Dane County has identified today as the day that we are now officially in phase 1. And they are opening the possibility of gatherings of up to 50 or 25% of a sanctuary's capacity, but not more than 50. Even if you have a 1,000-seat cathedral, you don't get more than 50 in there. I would guess I think very few of our congregations have yet opened for a Sunday morning service. I think there are several now who are considering in the first weeks in June, beginning to do that. I heard of one pastor this morning whose council was eager to begin, and she shared with them some information, the ELCA guidance and the letters I've sent out, and some other protocols, and they looked at all of that, the council did, and said, well, we're going to just sit tight for a few more weeks. We're not going to rush into this. There's still plenty of reason for caution. Those that are beginning to plan for worship are doing it with a lot of caution, I think, appropriate caution, with a lot of safety protocols that you can find on ELCA website and other places in terms of how to govern the distancing, how to have people sit separately, how to refrain from singing, which the scientists are now telling us is one of the most dangerous things we can do. The importance of cloth masks being used. There's even I've read suggestions of avoiding anything that involves any kind of touching of things together. A lot of sanitizing of doorknobs and that sort of thing. Maybe have somebody, one person at the door. Removing hymnals and welcome cards and things. Maybe not even using bulletins, or if you use bulletins, put them in the pew, safe distanced apart to indicate where people ought to sit. So there's many things to think about as you plan to come back together again in worship. And congregations are doing that. I'd have a couple of reminders that I think are important to keep in mind as we move in that direction. One is make sure the planning discussions leading towards this have been thorough and exhausting and probably taking longer than some people want them to take. But there's a lot to be considered and a lot to be owned, because you are, scientists would say, you are inviting your congregation into a more high-risk setting than they were when they're simply staying at home. Now, if it's a public will to say we want to begin to do that, then everybody should be aware that that's been thought through carefully and acknowledge that there is risk to what we're doing. There is no absolutely safe way to be doing this. So to carefully consider it and carefully communicate it. And communication is hard these days because people don't see each other. Word of mouth is harder. Not everybody's on email. Not everybody's able to participate with the online things we've been doing. So to make sure everybody understands what's going on is awfully important. And thirdly, I think to practice tolerance of contrasting viewpoints. I mean, we in the church have always said we ought to be able to model that better than the society at large, where we tend to demonize contrasting viewpoints. Well, in this case, we're simply in a whole extraordinary situation that none of us anticipated, none of us have been in before. We take advice from the scientists who know this well. We have to balance that with the public behaviors and the needs that we have to be together. And all of us weigh all of these complex factors differently. So for us to be able to be tolerant and stay in conversation, listening to one another as we make these decisions, I think is very important. I see Don Glanzer has posted the question, what, if any, is synod guidance? I presume, Don, you're asking if there is a position that the synod is taking. And there isn't an official position. There is the guidance that I have sent out before. I continue to come down on the side of caution. If I were a parish pastor, my advice to my congregation would be, I think even though the May 26th threshold has been passed, the situation really hasn't changed. And as people begin to open up, we may in fact experience a lifting up again of the trend lines. I would just as soon wait a few more weeks. I know of several congregations that have simply said, let's just wait till July to see where things stand. That's the position I'd be most comfortable being in, and I think a number of our congregations are in that spot as well. So that's enough for me to be rattling on. Let's see what kinds of questions or observations. I'd be interested in hearing from those of you on this call where you're at, where you and or your congregation are at in processing this whole decision about when and how to reopen.
I think Don's got a great idea there. If you have a comment, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we'll see you and we'll call on you. That way we won't have everybody talking at once. So Don, go ahead. I saw your hand first.
I appreciate that, that guidance, Bishop Peter. There are significant voices in the congregations that are eager to worship, especially since they can go to the bars and swimming pools and the rest of that nonsense. So I appreciate the view of honoring other viewpoints. However, what do you do if you're convinced to the contrary, that this is too soon? This is, we lose nothing by waiting a few weeks. It's just knowing our congregation, as I do, primarily older and then therefore at risk. Open the doors, they will come. Because they are faithful church attenders, and they just will. So trying to balance the obligation, not the obligation, but the privilege of helping people stay safe with the other voices that want to come together because of the sacredness that the sanctuary holds for so many people.
Sure. Yeah, you've put your finger exactly on one of the key considerations, and that is that a whole lot of our most faithful members, you talk about your congregation being mostly older. I think even in congregations where that's not the case, whatever older membership they have within their total congregation, they're going to be the first ones in the door. That's where they've been on Sunday morning their whole life, and they miss it a lot, and they're going to be coming back, and they shouldn't. The fact is, all the evidence says, all the CDC stuff, all the stuff from from the Wisconsin Health Department. I mean, people over 65 shouldn't be going out unless they have to these days. And we as congregations in our care for people over 65 ought to be doing all we can, it seems to me, to encourage that understanding of the state of things. One of the things I didn't say, but I've said it, I think, in every other gathering I've been around, is I think it's terribly important that we continue to do online worship in our congregations and to remind people that is worship. We are participating in faith community. We are turning ourselves toward God and toward one another as we participate in online worship. I hope that continues. I think if I can put in an ad for what we might focus on for a bit in next week's conversation, I think it occurs to me that if some congregations are beginning to open up, whether in the next few weeks or a month or two from now, if they've been doing online and they want to continue to make worship available for people that shouldn't be coming, they should continue online even while they reopen, and encourage people that shouldn't be there to stay home. And I think people will continue to do that. Next week, we'll talk a bit about instead of pre-recording a service and putting that out, and then also planning for what you're going to do on Sunday, how hard is it to simply live stream what you do on Sunday so the people are actually participating with what you do on Sunday. And I've got Jason, who's on this call, that does our web stuff, and some others that I think can lead us in that conversation next week. But I think you're right, Don. I think there is nothing lost by staying closed, except for the loss of being together, which is a loss that we all feel. But there's a good reason why we're not together, and that reason hasn't gone away.
Thank you.
So Dave Bergeron, I think that kind of answered your question, unless you have a follow-up to that. No, you're good. Okay. Amy, let's go back to your question. you're asking for clarification on the comment of 50 people regardless of capacity.
We
And
just,
did you,
I read that, I just, in preparation for this call, I called up and read Forward Dane, and that's straight out of there. They indicate 25% of capacity, but for faith groups, 25% of capacity, but no more than 50 people.
okay, great. I just wanted to make sure I understood what you had said correctly. Thank you.
Which does, which does complicate, this again is part of the a complicating factor. If you do reopen, how are you going to enforce that? Do you have some, I've made the case all along, don't put pastors in the position of being the enforcers of masks or capacity or whatever. Whoever's making this decision, the council or whoever, they then take the responsibility for seeing that people comply with mask wearing and that sort of thing. But the capacity issue means, do you have somebody stand at the door with a counter and number 51 and 52 can't come in? Sorry, better luck next week. Or do we schedule more services? I know of one congregation that's talking about just doing several services. They've never done more than one on a Sunday morning, but they'd have to do. And I think we're going to find, well, I can tell you this anecdote. Some of you know that last year I served as the interim pastor of the Bratislava International Congregation in Slovakia, an ELCA mission post. And it was a small congregation of people from all over the world, literally about 60 average attendance probably on a Sunday morning. Slovakia has shut down like we did, and they are just now opening up. So for the past 2 weeks, this congregation of typical average attendance of 60 has had worship on Sunday morning. They had 14 one Sunday and 17 the other Sunday. I think, and frankly, I think that's not a bad sign. It means people are taking seriously the permission or the advocacy for staying home for a while yet. That's a good thing. I like, I see Rami, oops, I think Rami didn't post that publicly. She did to me, but I'm gonna out you, Rami. She read an article about this topic titled, why can I go to Walmart but not to church? And the article talks about differing values, profit, sales, that sort of thing. That's why Walmart's real anxious to open up and get people in there. Churches are not there for profit or for sales. We're there for service and for care of one another, care of neighbor. It's another set of values that says there are some good reasons why churches may stay closed longer than commercial businesses are. There's also the question, I see, can the Synod notify us when the health experts officially declare they're giving the green light for groups of 50 for the state and recommendations for counties? It's a challenge I've discovered, because I did a little hunting around for this. It is a challenge to stay on top of counties. I mean, many county health departments are pretty small operations. Dane County, of course, has a big department and a very sophisticated website and communications. So that was easy to get. I think we'll try to do that. We're watching it, frankly, because as you know, we are poised to call for a Synod assembly to happen at 11 different sites, but we don't know when that's going to happen yet, because we'll keep attendance at each site under 50. That's our plan. And but we don't know when that's going to be yet. We have to wait for that 50 threshold to be across the Synod. And it looks, there are some indications now that it looks like that may be in July, as early as sometime in July. So we'll keep an eye on this and try and communicate that as best we can.
We have a lot of those resources on the Synod website. Jason Zhang's on the call right now. He's our webmaster. So anytime we have an update to any of those health resources in particular, those get posted to the Synod website. Is that on the Connected Community page, or where's the best way to find that, Jason?
It's on the health resources page, and right now I did a search. USA Today is kind of keeping a list, and in Wisconsin, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel is their paper. So they have a list that was last updated on the 23rd, and the only two counties in our synod that currently have a county order are Dane and Rock. Greene County has dropped theirs. So I have those two plans up there. I just heard from a pastor a little while ago I was on the phone with that SALC has published some guidelines for faith communities that they're going to follow. But as far as enforceable orders, Dane and Rock are the only two. And so we have those on the health resources page at the moment. But I don't have the other counties. I have a link to all of their websites on there. They posted. That was back when the pandemic started back in March, so it's further down on the list, but those are all there as well to kind of look. But a lot of what's out there now are just guidance of some ideas, or this is what we recommend.
Someone's got to educate me. We don't have to do it during the meeting, I guess, but some of the stuff that I see chatted, some says privately and some says to everyone, and I don't really know what the difference is.
I don't think these are private.
But
these are for everyone.
Okay. The question about multiple services and the challenge that poses for a pastor who's going to be present in all of those services, and frankly could well then serve as the vector or the person passing on contact from one person to another. I think many of the protocols that I've read about, the guidance pieces that Jason is talking about, many of them are make repeated references to how frequently disinfecting and sanitizing needs to happen, that hand washing or hand sanitizing, just a whole lot, even during a service, before and after communion, or if communion is being done. Certainly between services, wiping down, if there are between services, wiping down the surfaces like door handles and so on that anybody might be touching. And that especially goes for the pastor who's going to be present for all of it. And you know, what if the pastor is an asymptomatic carrier of the virus, isn't aware of it, but if you are an asymptomatic carrier, you can be passing it on without having any idea that you're sick or putting others in danger. I mean, it's just one more dimension of the caution that we all have to be living with in the midst of all this. Outdoor worship. Let's talk a little bit about outdoor worship. The Dane County guidance also applies, I was a little surprised to see this, but also applies, it acknowledges outdoor worship is better than indoor worship because the space isn't confined and the air therefore isn't confined. So the communication danger is less, but the Dane guidelines still say maximum of 50, even for an outdoor worship setting. Now I suspect we've got, I know some congregations, Dale, who's on this call, was one of them, started early doing parking lot worship where people just stayed in their cars with their windows rolled up. And I don't know why there would be any numerical limit on that sort of a size gathering. But now that weather has turned nice, now I think most people are talking about outdoor worship where they where they may bring lawn chairs, or they may sit, spaced out in an outdoor amphitheater, or perhaps even in their cars, some in the cars, sitting outside the cars. But that, for Dane County anyway, they still say shouldn't be over 50 for that. And the danger, of course, in that is it's just in our human nature to mill around when we're outside and with a bunch of other people, and to sort of create a setting where that milling around is likely to happen is just lifting a little bit that risk factor that may be in play. Anne has her hand up, I see.
I worship at First Lutheran Church in Janesville, and they have a long history of doing parking lot worship, but they received permission specifically from the county and from the state, and the directions given to us as congregants are that we must stay in our car, and the building is locked, so we're not allowed to either get out of the car or use the building.
Mm-hmm.
That permission can be taken away. So that's been a helpful guidelines, I think.
Yeah.
Be working fine, but I know we have well over 50. Last Sunday we had 81 cars, so it's a bigger group.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Communion or no communion, Ann?
No communion. There's no way to do communion safely at
Right.
this time.
The part of the outdoor worship question also asked about masks and singing and communion. And I think, and here again, it's simply a matter of levels of risk, and no one can absolutely quantify that. But gathering together without masks is riskier than gathering together with masks. Singing is riskier than not singing. Doing communion in whatever way it's done is riskier than not doing communion. So in each case, you can find some ways perhaps to lower the risk a bit, but each is a risk factor. 2 weeks ago, I got stumped in this, or was it in one of the conference Zoom meetings I was in? I can't remember. But somebody had said, well, in our congregation, we decided we wanted to have communion, but to eliminate the risk, we just told each family unit to bring their own wine and bread. And I have to confess, I was stumped when I first heard that. I didn't quite know how to react because part of me, I just wanted to say, no, we're gathered around the same table. This isn't a bring your own party. But then the more I thought about it, and then I noticed, frankly, on the ELCA guidelines, it's even listed as one of the possibilities to be considered. But I realized that's just sort of a knee-jerk reaction out of my own experience of we eat in common. We bless and we eat this. This is my body. This is my bread. It's not, you didn't bring your own. But that's, I mean, are we really going to say that the words of institution, the consecrating of those elements only works for what's sitting on the office altar, and it doesn't work for something that's 30 or 40 feet away? That's, we're in extraordinary times. We're just doing things differently to cope with the reality of what we're in. And I think there are some of these ideas that, as I said, we have to be a little quick to catch ourselves in being too negative to other people's ideas. We just sort of need to mull all of this stuff over together, I think.
Before we move to Peg's question, Dale, Dale, you're raising your hand, but I also had a question for you, but you go first.
Well, we were going to offer communion on Pentecost again, our second time of having it, and I'm scheduled to be tested for COVID-19 tomorrow. I was wondering what the bishop's thoughts were on should pastors take advantage of medical science, and with the thought of that we could be unwitting asymptomatic transmitters of the virus, would it be a good idea? Would it be preferable? Would it be recommended that that we be tested periodically? I wanted to know what the bishop thought about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Dale, and I've puzzled over that as businesses have been opened. If there are, if there are people at checkout counters or people in doctors' offices dealing with coming into contact with folks regularly because that's what they do at work, shouldn't they all be tested? And in that same vein, then, shouldn't we as pastors be tested because we're going to be contacting people? So I think if there are tests available, that's a very good thing to do, I think. I think that's, yeah, I would encourage that. I think there's good reason to be thinking of doing that.
Yeah, Don.
I would caution, I think probably getting tested is a good idea, but I would caution that unless you're being tested for the antibodies, all the test does is tell you whether or not you're infected at the time the test was taken, not 3 days later when you get the results.
Yeah, but it would be a point of caution for people if anyone who got tested and realized they were a carrier. Then it clearly had been a good thing to be tested and be forewarned to stay away from other people at that point.
Right, and I say that after having been tested about 10 days ago.
I want to go to Peg's question because it's a question that has come up often. Peg Hager, I'll read it. Following lengthy discussion process among church leaders, is it ultimately the role of the elected leaders to own the decisions that are made? And the follow-up question, if a rostered leader is uncomfortable with the decision, what's your best advice for the way in which they respond? I think that's a great question because it's a thorny question. Let me take the first one first. I think it is the role of the elected leadership to make this kind of a decision. That's what they're there for. That's what they've been elected to do. You can't call a whole congregational meeting because that's obviously gathering a whole bunch of people for it. We discovered in this 2 weeks ago in this webinar call, the folks up at Bristol had sent out a questionnaire that Vicki subsequently shared with folks that were on the call, but they had sent out a questionnaire just asking people throughout the congregation their responses to these questions, a number of questions about gathering and how and that sort of thing. I think that was among other things, it was a good gesture of a sense of ownership of the whole of the congregation for these decisions moving forward. But I think ultimately it does fall to the elected leaders to decide how we're going to do this. So then let's move to that second question. What if what if a church council says, we're going to open on June 14, we're opening up, we're going to have service. And the pastor and perhaps other council members as well, who are in the minority, just feel that's a bad decision. They feel unsafe. It becomes particularly critical question if the pastor herself or himself is in one of the risk groups, which a number of us are. Some of the elderly thresholds are lower than 65 even, but we've got number of pastors over 65 and certainly many over 55 or 60 that by just definition of age, much less other health things. And we've got a number of pastors that fall in the other at-risk health categories at all, diabetes, overweight, health issues, compromised immune systems, all of those. We have raised for a discussion among the ELCA bishops, and I think it's on tap to be discussed this Thursday at our weekly 1-hour check-in time. The bishops in our region talked about this question and posed and said, we'd like to hear from Sue Rothmeyer, the secretary, and the general counsel of the ELCA, Tom Cuniff. We'd like them to give us some advice to what should be the way forward if a church council dictates that we are going to open, and a pastor, say a pastor with diabetes, says, I will not do it. I think our sense was there has to be support for a pastor making those kinds of decisions for those kinds of legitimate reasons. But how best we navigate that, I'm not sure. I heard from one pastor who was very worried about a decision of their council going forward, and after continued conversation, they backed off of that decision to move forward and decided we're going to wait a while. So I've not had that land on my lap yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if it does. And I worry about that. My inclination will be to find some way to be supportive of the pastor who says, that, to use the word that was used, that terrifies me to be suddenly in that position of convening a group of folks in church. Tough question. Another question. The conversation going on around baptism, I've heard a good bit of that conversation. In most cases, the baptisms are being postponed that I've heard of. I have heard of a few being done with a very small gathering of less than 10. But the baptism itself is just the physical act of it means somebody's going to be close to somebody in that process. So there's no way to do it and have everybody observe 6-foot distancing unless you're not going to actually baptize with water. I did hear one suggestion of the pastor presiding over the baptism, but the parent who was holding the child being the one to actually put the water on. I'd never thought of that as a possibility, but that was done in one instance that I heard of. But in most cases, baptisms, like many other things, weddings, funerals, I know a number of pastors have had funerals where they've gathered just a few people graveside with the idea that a memorial service or something like that will be held at another time. Communion for those who are homebound and not online. Whether communion or not, the whole issue of the people that aren't online is one that I know that's simply a burden, because we try and say, here we have these opportunities for people to worship together online, and there are some who just aren't there. They don't do that. My uncle, who turns 98 on, his kids have finally gotten him onto a flip phone, but that's as far as he gets technologically. So I don't know how you best stay in touch other than phone calls with them. And again, bringing communion is, I've not heard that talked about a lot among pastors. In fact, I'd be interested in some of you pastors on this call. What's been your interaction both with the people that, both with the elder members that you have for whom coming and doing homebound communion has been part of your practice? What have you done in these last 2-3 months?
Phone calls only, Mr. Peter.
Mm-hmm.
No in-person communion.
Yeah, I suspect if we did polls of people, that would be what most of them would say, I think. And I would guess most of them would be pretty understanding of that if they know there isn't worship. I mean, people aren't going to church and getting communion either, frankly.
Stacy, you had a comment?
Yeah, just about the home communion. I personally have not done this, but I have seen a colleague who said that he gathered with a couple who were at least able to get out of their house and meet them at the end of their driveway. It was the BYOB, you know, they brought their own bread and their own wine or grape juice. And they sat a distance apart. And he said it was nothing like, you know, like we have with communion when we gather together, yet it was still a very sacred and holy moment to be there with these two people and having communion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when the weather allows us to be outside, I think that offers a potential, at least a little more possibilities. Of course, being aware of the fact that we can't take too many risks with that, right? So that is what one of my colleagues did as far as communion for those who are homebound. Let them outside and shared communion that way.
Mm. This is one of those areas where I think pastoral practice gets shaped in large part by the pastoral heart and the pastoral relationship that you have with your people. I'm sure many understand that this is a time when personal visits shouldn't be happening. They understand that, and therefore they understand communion shouldn't happen. And then you may run across those for whom that's just heart-wrenching, and you figure out another way to respond. A question just popped up about Bible camps, an issue near and dear to my heart. I up until we left for Slovakia, I was serving on a camp board, in fact, of a camp that I had worked at as a young person for many years. This is a really tough time for camps because they depend on the income that comes in the summer when campers show up, and most of them are closing down for campers this summer, and they're laying off staff. The staff that most of them had hired ready to come, they've said, sorry, there's no job for you this summer. But every camp has year-round operational costs that depend on the summer activity to carry them, and they're without that now. I think an appeal, the board that I was on has sent out an appeal saying, you know, our fixed costs are still here. Can you give additional support, whether it's congregational or an individual donor base? I think most of our camps are having to find ways to do that. I've heard from some bishops. I don't think I've heard from any in Wisconsin yet, but I've heard from some bishops out east of a couple of camps that have simply already decided they were fragile enough financially, and this is a straw that breaks the back, and they are going out of existence. It's a tough time for camps.
Don, you had something to add?
Yeah, just in that particular aspect, given that we're going to lay the authority at the church council, to what extent should the church council have a say in whether or not to send youth from the congregation to camps? Like in our case, as far as I know, Sugar Creek is still open in July for our confirmants. But do we leave that up to the parents, or does that come from a leadership perspective, given our previous conversation?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, frankly, I can make an argument either way, that this is a decision affecting kids, and parents ought to have a say in that, including if they want to send their kid The contrary argument could be, well, if it's my congregation that has arranged for this week at camp, then the congregation bears responsibility for this decision. So I think if it's I guess the way I'd parse it is to say, if it's a congregational event, but it's taking place at a camp, then the congregation, I mean, like if you were saying this is a part of your confirmation instruction that you're expected to be at this camp and the pastor goes along or other teachers go along or whatever, if it's a congregational event, then I think the congregation could call it off. But if it's simply kids from a congregation signing up to go to a week at camp, then I think the decision is between the camp and the parents.
And not to be too parochial on this, but in our case, confirmation camp is a part of the confirmation curriculum, and the money that's generated, the confirmants don't pay any money. That money comes from through the congregation as part of fundraisers throughout the year. So I mean, it clearly has a congregational.
Yeah. Well, then I think the council does have a right to say it. I would to make the decision. I would hope they would do it in conversation with parents and perhaps with. I mean, certainly the camp would be working to assure you of safety measures being taken, but I think the parents and the council would then be the decision makers on it.
And again, the safety can't be guaranteed. I mean, there is some element of risk regardless of what happens. Exactly.
Which is the caveat that belongs with virtually everything we're talking about. I mean, every step we take involves some risk. Eric has his hand up again.
Well, a couple of things that we can do for Sugar Creek right now, and I suppose for Lutherdale and some of the other camps is, I know Sugar Creek has their cabins opened up for they're especially hoping to attract people as a bed and breakfast for a little bit. But I think they also are inviting pastors to come and spend some time there to get away. I think they have a fee for non-pastors. I think for lay people to come, they're trying to do some income with that. But for pastors, they're just asking for a donation. But it's a great place, I think, just to get away as one needs. They're asking that you stay out of all the other buildings. You will be assigned one cabin. You'll live there for the days you're there. Then it'll sit vacant for 72 hours until the next person can come and use that cabin. And that will allow them to go in and clean it after someone's left. They've also they're hiring 4 of their summer staff through the summer. And they've got a team of 4 other people that they were going to have on the summer staff who are social media savvy and are going to do all sorts of all the different social media ways that people connect. They're going to be trying to put together all sorts of programs to reach out to you. So we might want to encourage our youth to tap into that resource. It's going to be a free resource, and I think they're going to do some VBS stuff too. So
I have yet to virtually ride a horse, though, Eric.
Right. I think I have. So.
Carl, you had something to add.
What I'm aware of is that Lutherdale planning the first part of July, I think July 1st, to open up at 50%. And they have a plan where they will have the groups separated into small groups almost the entire day, even in the dining area. But they've been hit a lot. I know the staff has taken a 20% pay cut. And, it's really struck them hard, but they're going to try. And they have hired their summer staff. I'm not sure what they're doing in June with them, but I know in July, they're going to try to run at least 6 weeks of camp.
I think we're getting close to our time here, but one other question was just posted, and it had to do with whether there's the possibility of congregational liability if somebody if someone gets COVID-19 and it can be traced back to either the congregation or a camp that the congregation sent their kids to, and there. The question was, have bishops had any conversation about that? We have, and that's been part of the reason why we have said in the letters I've sent out and that you see other places is if you make a decision to open up, particularly if your decision, this was germane a few weeks back, if your decision is running in the face of what is the current advice about gathering, then yes, then attorneys would say, yeah, don't rule out the possibility that if it's traced to you, you could be sued for that. If it can be shown that your organization acted contrary to what the guidance from the health department had been at the time. Now that those health department restrictions are being relaxed, if a congregation or a camp is operating within those guidelines, the chances of legal liability are small. Although any attorney that you consult will say the first thing out of their mouth is, now remember, anybody can sue anybody for anything. So you can't ever say you can't be sued. The question is does there appear to be legal grounds for the suit? And if you're following the guidelines, you're probably safe. But it's not a bad idea if you've got an attorney to run it past them. Looks like Sarah either has a hand up or she's reaching.
Yes, I do. And this came up a couple times and wasn't addressed, but some of us are in rural counties and our percentage of COVID cases are maybe 20% that of Dane County. My congregation, St. Mary's Catholic Church across town is opening up this weekend. We're having a meeting this Thursday to talk about opening up the first weekend in June using a lot of the distancing things. And I don't know whether we're not all in Dane County, we're not all in an urban setting. So things work. I'm very, very conscious of this. I'm really careful, but things do work a little differently, I think. I'm just, is that worth having a little bit of a conversation about?
Oh yeah, I think all of these congregational discussions are situational. That for not only where are you located geographically, but what are the demographics of your own congregational membership? What are the ability? How able are you to provide for adequate spacing and sanitation and all of that? There are a lot of variables, and I think we still haven't gone up to our lake cabin in Minnesota, but it's one of only 2 counties in Minnesota that haven't had 1 case yet. So it does vary a lot, and I think that's worthy of being taken into consideration as well.
Jamie Rising asked a question earlier that we didn't address, and I think it's a really important one because it is about walking together. And she says, is there synodical support for the ministry that is taking place now online and crosses geographical boundaries? Is there space for a conversation about collaboration and innovation during this time? And I think we could probably spend a whole hour on this topic. I'm wondering if that's something that everyone would be interested in talking about. And you can use the chat room or the participant area to vote yes if you would like to spend an hour talking about how we as congregations might collaborate with one another and share resources. Jamie, did you want to add anything to that?
It just seems like an exciting time to connect. And I know that we have a number of congregations without leadership right now. And we are doing a Bible study that is multi-congregational and has pulled in some of those folks throughout 2 conferences and are collaborating with the neighboring conference. And just wondering if anybody else is doing something like that, if you're interested in joining what we have going on. It's going through the end of July. Just kind of wondering how we're thinking about the people that we are reaching right now and some of the people who are able to be at church because of the format now.
I think, Jamie, I think that's a great observation. I do know of a couple other places where congregations that are vacant right now are without a pastor. have been connected with neighboring congregations that have said, come and join our, be a part of what we're doing. I think what you're doing there in the Platteville area is terrific. And I'd use that observation as a launch pad to make one other observation, and that is when we did the, if you've heard me say this before, I'm sorry, but I think it bears repeating. When back in January and February, when we had over 300 people at those town hall meetings around the synod, and we said, so describe, and half of the discussion was describe the synod and what are we facing and what's going on here. There was an awful lot of response in those discussion groups saying, we need help in figuring out what the future looked like, because the way we've done church in past generations is fading. And we need, how do we begin to think about new models? How do we begin to think about what the future might look like? And I think if there's one thing positive that could be said about the pandemic and all of that is brought on, it may be that it has forced that question among us right smack in front of our nose in a way that wasn't there before. So to use this moment as a time to explore what else might collaboration, what else might some model of doing church other than every congregation as self-sustaining and independent organizational entity. Is there another way to be God's people in this area that thinks about it in other ways? So and the one example you raised, Jamie, of what you're doing there with that Bible study among several congregations is a great example of saying, what if that becomes not just an emergency tactic, but what if that becomes one model of doing church?
Great. Well, we look like we're at our closing time here, but before your final comments, Bishop, I did want to share something with the group and encourage you. I'm sharing my screen now. Hopefully you can see that. It is the Synod website. We encourage all of you, if you haven't yet looked at the, some of the other streamed worship services from some of the other congregations. Here's our Staying Connected resources here for connected community. And Jason, tell me, let's see, I should know this, but if you go to the home page, correct me if I'm wrong, we want to encourage you to look at the Bishop Nominee Forum. And I wanted to show you where that was on the Synod website. So if you go to the Synod website, this is our landing page. And if you haven't looked at the forums yet, you can get there by going to the Bishop election page. I'll arrow through here. Bishop election, hit more. And on this page, you'll find the report of the call committee, and you'll find the May 22nd nominee form. You can watch it here. The next one will be on June 25th, correct, Bishop?
29.
Or 29th?
It'll be recorded then and should be up either later that day or the next morning on the 30th.
Okay, and then in the meantime, we do encourage you to submit questions. Our nominees will be addressing questions that are submitted by any of us at that next forum. And down here on this page, as you can see, I'm on the SESWELCA.org 2020 Bishop election page, and this is where you can click to submit a question to be answered by our nominees. So it's a really easy way to do. Jason set that up for us, and we want to thank him for that. So just a little plug there to stay connected in that regard and engage in the bishop election process. I'll get back to my screen and unshare and hand it back to you, Bishop, for any final comments.
Well, only final comment is thanks, not just for being part of this conversation, although I think the more of these conversations we're a part of, we gain from each other's presence and insights and thoughts. That's very helpful. But it is who we are, as we are church together, to use the phrase of the assembly theme. It's what a synod is. It's a gathering of people. So thanks for being part of this gathering, but thanks even more for the ways you lead, care for your people, and carry forward the mission that God has given us in this place. It's a privilege to be part of it all.
Feel free to join us again next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. We'll be doing this weekly. And have a great week. God's blessings.
Thanks, Vicki.
Thanks, Vicki.